Hi, and welcome to week 7 of our DocSem and ABA. This week you read about extinction, differential reinforcement procedures, and antecedent interventions. In this video, we're going to briefly remind everyone that there are SAFMEDS sign-ups posted on Canvas, and then I'll go through answering the study guide questions for chapters 21, 22, and 23, and then briefly review the requirements of the self-management project. Okay, let's begin with chapter 21 on extinction. So the first question asks you to define extinction and discuss whether or not it was more than simply ignoring a behavior. So extinction is any time reinforcement of a previously reinforced behavior is discontinued. So something was reinforced, for example, every time a child whined, his parents would give in to his request. When we put that behavior on extinction, it means that the whines are no longer going to be reinforced, that the request is no longer going to be acknowledged if there's whining, and therefore, based on the principles of reinforcement, if a behavior is no longer getting reinforcement, it should diminish or decrease in the future. So here's a diagram of extinction. So let's use our water example again. So if we have an EO where you've been deprived of water for a long time, and most of us, right, have a history of reinforcement that when we turn the tap on the water faucet, water comes out. Okay, so we have this history of reinforcement. We really need water. We see a faucet marked with a blue dot or the letter C. We turn the tap, no water comes out. Okay, reinforcement has been withheld. It's not reinforcing. Nothing happened, right? So if you assume the tap is broken or the water's been turned off to the tap, so maybe once or twice you might turn it off and on, but you're not going to keep going back to that faucet and repeatedly trying to turn it on. You're assuming it's sort of broken. You're not going to get the reinforcement that you were seeking. So extinction is a procedure that provides zero probability of reinforcement. So when you're actually doing extinction, doing it with fidelity, it means that there's no way the individual that behavior is going to be reinforced. Okay, the faucet is broken, the water is not connected. No matter how many times you turn the faucet, it's not going to turn on. Now, the effectiveness of an extinction procedure totally depends on whether or not you can identify what are the reinforcing consequences. So what is the purpose, what's the function of the behavior, which we'll get into more in a few weeks when we talk about FBAs. And then it also has to be consistently applied, right? So if sometimes the faucet works and sometimes it doesn't, you're probably going to keep trying. So if sometimes when you whine, you get what you want, and sometimes you don't, you'll keep trying. Extinction, sometimes it has a connotation that there's some sort of aversive stimuli being applied, and that's not true. You don't have to do something aversive or negative, punishing. It's simply withholding reinforcement. Now, it doesn't totally prevent occurrences of problem behavior. It just decreases the likelihood. Okay, it means that problem behavior is no longer going to be reinforced. Does it mean your child will never whine? No, but they won't get reinforcement from whining. Often people think, so there's a procedural and functional form of extinction that your text talked about. So procedural just means you ignore the behavior. So it's whatever you see, I'm going to ignore and not attend to and not react to. I'm going to ignore the whining, meaning not pay attention to it. I'm going to ignore out of seat behavior or calling out behavior in the hopes that that's going to decrease those problem behaviors. But actually, it's not super effective, right? Because we may not know why the student is calling out in class, for example. Is it to get our attention or to get someone else's attention? So what we should do is do a functional behavior analysis, again, as we'll talk about later, to know what is the function of the behavior, why are they doing what they're doing, what reinforcement are they seeking, not what we think, and then we withhold that reinforcement. So there's a couple of misuses of the term extinction. One is when we use extinction to refer to a decrease in any behavior. So sometimes they're really referring to your behavior has extinguished, like putting out a fire, but extinction doesn't have anything to do necessarily with that, with the individual. It's where they're getting reinforcement. The person or the thing or the entity controlling reinforcement is what applies extinction. Labeling any reduction in behavior that goes down to a zero rate as extinction is just incorrect. A second misuse is confusing forgetting and extinction. So in forgetting, it means the behavior is weakened by the passage of time. So the individual might not have an opportunity to omit this behavior. Okay, so if it's something that we've just learned or they just saw one time or picked up over the weekend and then haven't had the chance to do it again, it might not be that the behavior had been extinguished or decreased due to extinction. They may have just forgotten and not had the opportunity. In extinction, the behavior is weakened because it doesn't produce reinforcement. Number 3, sometimes we confuse response blocking and sensory extinction, meaning that response blocking is when you don't allow someone to do a self-injurious behavior. So let's say you have a child that repeatedly is trying to poke their eyes. Okay, simply putting your hand up above their eyes isn't necessarily going to extinguish the behavior. They just no longer have the opportunity to do it. With extinction procedures, the individual can still omit the problem behavior. They're just not going to receive reinforcement for it. And then finally, confusing non-contingent reinforcement and extinction. So luckily, you also read about non-contingent reinforcement, so we'll get into that. But it has to do with extinction diminishes the behavior by changing consequence stimuli, right? So child sees cookie, child whines for cookie, and parent does not give child cookie, that's extinction. Non-contingent reinforcement has to do with manipulating the antecedent stimuli. So what happens before? So I give you a cookie in the car, or I give you a snack to hold while you're in the grocery cart. Now you're probably not going to whine for a cookie because you've already been satiated. All right, number 2, ask for an example of using extinction for behaviors maintained by various reinforcement schedules. So I have some examples. So here's an example of behavior maintained by positive reinforcement, right? So let's see, a child sees the bakery section of Publix, child whines cookie, positive reinforcement, child goes to bakery and asks for cookie. That could also be, right, if you're looking at the parent behavior, that could be negative reinforcement because the whining, the aversive stimuli is now being taken away. If you look at the extinction procedure, we're manipulating the consequence, right? So it's no longer anything. It's a neutral consequence. Child sees bakery section of Publix, whines cookie, parent keeps shopping. Here's an example of extinction for a behavior maintained using negative reinforcement. And it's really escape extinction. So remember, negative reinforcement is when you're escaping from something aversive. And so extinction would be not allowing that escape. So in this case, let's say the student is asked to start independent work. They ask the teacher if they can call home sick. The teacher allows them to call home. The aversive stimuli being independent work, and they're being reinforced by that work being taken away. They're allowed to leave the classroom. Negative, using extinction in this case, if the student asks to start independent work, then they ask the teacher to call home sick, and the teacher just continues class or makes them do their work. It's on extinction. They're no longer going to receive reinforcement. And finally, here's an example of automatic reinforcement. So behaviors, remember, automatic reinforcement are things that just feel good, sound good, taste good, look good, right? To I think our authors call it intact organisms. So behaviors maintained by automatic reinforcement are placed on extinction by masking or removing the sensory consequence. So it's really sensory extinction. This should be used with extreme caution when it comes to self-stimulatory behaviors that are maintained by social consequences or negative reinforcement, meaning they're escaping from something. This may not be an effective or ethical procedure. But here's an example from when I was teaching. anytime the student's hands were not occupied, usually while the teacher was talking or doing a read aloud, the student would start to pick their cuticles to the point where they were bleeding because it felt good. So what we did was we added gloves. So the student can still sort of do the picking motion, but they aren't able to actually accomplish the breaking the skin. So it didn't feel as good. They didn't get that reinforcement. Number 3 asks to describe the following effects of extinction. So an extinction burst is just an immediate increase in frequency of a response after removal of reinforcement. Okay, so it means it's really related to the second component of initial increase in response amplitude, meaning things are going to get worse before they get better, but that actually means that it's working. So when you see that extinction burst, it helps you know that, I targeted the right thing. I have found that sore spot or the problem. And then another component that's common is spontaneous recovery. It's usually short-lived and limited if extinction procedures remain, right? So the key component to extinction working is for you to consistently apply it. And so sometimes, we have the extinction burst, we were ready for that, things are getting, improving, and then all of a sudden we have a resurgence in the problem behavior. And often people will then give up or switch to something different because they say, oh, well, it's not working. Well, that's not true. So Brooke had a good graph giving the example of what extinction effects we see. So before reinforcement, and then you see during extinction, we have this extinction burst, it gets better, and then we had this flare up. We don't want to give up during the flare up, right? We want to stay the course. Next question asked, why are behaviors maintained on intermittent schedules of reinforcement more resistant to extinction than those on a continuous reinforcement schedule, right? And that's because when things are on an intermittent or variable reinforcement schedule, the individual is already used to waiting, right? They're not used to getting reinforced every single time, but sometimes they might be, right? So they're used to a thin schedule of random reinforcement. The EO is really high, and they're used to that EO being high, so they know how to wait it out, right? And so that's why it's important that we use extinction procedures with fidelity, because once you give in, you've just strengthened the response. Now they know, I'm just going to have to wait a really long time. Question 5 wanted to know about good examples or situations when, examples or situations when it would not be appropriate to use extinction. And I want to make, I'm not going to go over your specific examples. I'll read those when I grade your discussion guides. But to review, it said we don't use extinction when the behavior on extinction is imitated by others. So when there's imitation at play. So if you have multiple students who are whining, then that may not be the appropriate time to use extinction. And then for extreme behaviors, things like self-injury or destruction of property, you may combine extinction with another procedure, functional communication training, DRO, something like that. But you don't want to just use it by itself because you want to find something that is very strong and quick and efficient. Next up, Chapter 22 on Differential Reinforcement, DR procedures. So question 1 wanted to know, what is DR? What's differential reinforcement? Is it only for problem behavior? So differential reinforcement is when you reinforce one response class while withholding reinforcement for another response class. Okay. Remember, response classes are different behaviors that serve the same function. Okay, so we have different types of waves, we have different nonverbal ways of communicating to a child to sit down. Okay, so those are all different behaviors within a response class that have the same function on the environment. So differential reinforcement is we reinforce one sort of response class and then ignore another. Here's a diagram of differential reinforcement. So let's say the EO is that the student has been deprived of one-on-one attention for a long time. So they really they are deprived of social attention. It has an evocative effect. And the parent says, play by yourself while I wash the dishes. If the child plays with toys, the praise is going to be delivered. Okay. But if the child tantrums, praise is withheld. Okay, so the goal here being that playing with toys will occur more often but tantrums will occur less often. Okay, because we are not reinforcing tantruming, we're reinforcing playing with toys. So there's several different DR procedures. I'm going to go over a few of them. One is DRI, right? So differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. So in this case, to back up, the differences between the different DR procedures has to do with which responses are going to be reinforced and which responses are not going to be reinforced. Okay, and so some of these procedures are more effective than others depending on what your goal is. Okay, so in a DRI procedure, we're going to identify what is a behavior that would be incompatible with the inappropriate behavior, and we're going to reinforce that. And then we're going to withhold reinforcement for instances of problem behavior. So for example, if the problem behavior is getting out of your seat, being out of seat, you cannot be in your seat and out of your seat at the same time. So we're going to reinforce in-seat behavior and put out of seat behavior on extinction. So your second question was about Walter. Said as a young man who frequently engages in self-injurious behavior, he bites the fingers on his right hand with such force that his fingers often bleed. You were asked to describe a DRI procedure to reduce Walter's finger biting. So again, DRI is where we reinforce a behavior that cannot happen at the same time as the problem behavior, meaning incompatible. Okay, so the inappropriate behavior is biting of the right hand. What is incompatible with biting your hand? Having your hand out of your mouth. Can't bite it if it's not in your mouth, right? So you're going to reinforce when hands are not in mouth and ignore hands being in mouth or put it on extinction. A second procedure is DRA, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. So this is something that is more desirable, but it's not necessarily incompatible, okay? And still the reinforcement is withheld for the problem behavior. So how do you know which one you pick, DRI or DRA? First, you want to select an incompatible or alternative behavior. This isn't a time to teach a totally new skill. We want to select a behavior that the child already has. It should require equal or less effort, right? So we don't want something that's new or difficult to do. You should be able to naturally do it at a high enough rate that they're going to have opportunities for reinforcement, and something that's likely to be reinforced in a natural environment, so it's not something super contrived. You then want to think about what are some reinforcers that you have control over. Think back to the preference assessment discussion we had. And you also want to use an FBA, which we haven't yet talked about, but to identify what the function of the behavior is. Then you want to reinforce that incompatible or alternative behavior immediately and consistently, and withhold reinforcement for the problem behavior. You may decide, though, that some mistakes are tolerable, right? So if we're thinking about out-of-seat behavior, maybe being out of your seat once or twice is okay, and especially if maybe the student's going from being out of their seat 15 times in a 30-minute class period, we might say, well, you could get out maybe 2 times and still consider it successful. But we're often going to incorporate other procedures with DRI and DRA. So another example of a DR procedure is DRO, or differential reinforcement of other behavior. Okay, so this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with is the other behavior incompatible or just alternate. It's just another behavior. So in this case, you're going to deliver reinforcer when the problem behavior has not occurred for a specific amount of time. So we're pretty much reinforcing any time you've done something other than the problem behavior. Okay, so it's reinforcement for not responding. You're reinforcing the absence of a problem behavior. So you were asked to give an example of using a fixed interval DRO to reduce Walter's finger biting, because as your book went into, there are many different schedules of DRs that you can use. So first, you're going to set the interval. So let's say 1 minute. So I'm going to have like a timer on my iPad, or they have apps for your smartwatches or things like that. And if At the end of timer, Walter did not bite his hands, you're going to provide reinforcement. Now, as I mentioned, DR procedures are often done in combination with other things. So maybe we're going to use a visual timer so that Walter can see when the time is up and when he's going to receive reinforcement. Maybe you have a first then schedule of no hand biting, and then you get tickles or a fan or whatever he's working on. And if he bites hands, though, the timer starts over. Okay, he doesn't receive reinforcement. You want to recognize that there are some limitations of DRO. One is that it's really reinforcement of absence of problem behavior. So let's say that we are reinforcing absence of hand biting. There might be other inappropriate self-stimulatory behaviors, picking at hands, slapping face, hitting head, but we can only target one thing at a time. So you need to decide, are you targeting multiple things or one thing? And is your interval too long? Or does a student, especially if they have a severe disability, or this is something that's maintained via automatic reinforcement, maybe you need a really short interval for them to sort of catch on to what's happening. You want to set your DRO intervals so that they have an opportunity for frequent reinforcement. So in this case, your book talks about inner response time, IRT. So you want to look in baseline of how frequently are they emitting the problem behavior and use that data to help you determine what your interval should be so that it's equal to or slightly less than mean IRT. Okay, so if you're thinking about in baseline, I'm just observing Walter and I see that he is biting his hand or his finger every minute to 90 seconds. Okay, it goes anywhere in between there. Well, that means that he's seeking reinforcement for himself and controlling his own reinforcement at a pretty thick or dense schedule. So if I'm going to try and compete with that and extinguish that behavior, I'm going to need for it to be an even more dense schedule of reinforcement for not doing it, right? You have to make it enticing. But then at the same time, you don't want to inadvertently reinforce other undesirable behaviors. So let's say we're just targeting Walter's hand biting, but he's now replaced hand biting with cuticle picking. Okay. You don't want to be accidentally reinforcing the cuticle picking. So you want to be really careful about your data and your observation to keep a check on that. Now, we do want to start with a pretty thick schedule of reinforcement. We do want to gradually increase the interval and therefore fade the schedule of reinforcement. You can increase it by a constant duration of time. So it's 1 minute and then 1 minute and 30 seconds and then 2 minutes and then 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Or you could sort of increase intervals proportionately, so doubling, go 1 to 2 minutes, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, or based on learner's performance. You can sort of let that guide you. Generally, these procedures are pretty staff intensive, as you can imagine, so it might be that it's just one time period a day that you're focusing on a DRO procedure. So maybe you're just doing it during Walter's one-on-one reading instruction time because you feel like he's not really getting benefit from that because he's biting his fingers and his attention is sort of diverted. So once you've got it under control in one setting, then you want to extend it to other times of the day. Okay, the next one, or the last one that you focused on was differential reinforcement of low rates of responding. So in this case, you use it to decrease the frequency of occurrence. So sometimes there are behaviors that aren't in and of themselves inappropriate, but the rate at which someone emits them could be. So an example would be question asking. I had a student, super social. She would ask you 500 questions in a 30-minute math lesson, right? That's not a problem. I mean, question asking, we want that. But she was asking so many questions that she wasn't ever working independently, and it was really hard for me to help the other students. And so in this case, we wanted to decrease the number of questions that she was asking, but we didn't want to extinguish it. And there are several different types, one being full session. So you might say you can only ask 4 questions in the whole 45-minute math period. I would often give like question sticks to students, and they have to give me a stick every time they ask a question, and then they don't have any more. And if you only ask those 4, then you get your reinforcement. we want that reinforcement to match the function of the behavior. So maybe it would be, 3 minutes to chat with me. There's also interval schedules of reinforcement, or maybe you can only ask 4 questions every 10 minutes. Or maybe you can only ask 1 question within a 10-minute interval, or spaced responding. So maybe you can ask a question, but then you have to wait at least 5 minutes before you ask another question. So there is an additional resource that I will post on Canvas. I wrote a book chapter with Sarah Cox and Dr. Whalen about teaching behavior to students with autism and intellectual disability, or addressing behavioral needs. And we went pretty in depth into DR procedures. And so if you read that chapter, it's written in a teacher-friendly tone, but we gave multiple examples of these DRI, DRO, DRL procedures. All right, and your last chapter, chapter 23, on antecedent interventions. So it's important to understand sort of conceptually what antecedent interventions are and how they work. So antecedent interventions address both SDs and MOs. Remember, SDs evoke behavior due to past correlation with increased availability of reinforcement. So SDs are our green light. They make behavior happen because they tell us reinforcement is available. Okay. MOs, on the other hand, increase the frequency of behavior when an effective reinforcer is not available. Okay, so that's the abative or evocative effects. Each has different implications for how behavior change strategies can be implemented and manipulated. So they're both antecedents. They both occur before a behavior. They both can evoke or abate a behavior, but the way that an intervention would work for each of them is slightly different. So in your first question was, what is non-contingent reinforcement, and explain how you might use it for a student who talks out of turn frequently. Okay, so if we think about the EO, you didn't have to, by the way, necessarily draw this out into a 4-term contingency. I just thought it might be the most effective way for me to give an example. So your EO would be the student is deprived of attention, SD is teacher asks a question, student talks out of turn, therefore they get social attention. Okay, you want to turn this EO into an AO, so instead of the student being deprived of social attention and therefore the value of social attention as a reinforcer is high, you want to turn that into an AO where they're actually kind of satiated on social attention, and so it's not going to be as strong of a reinforcer. So you want to provide lots of opportunities to talk, decreasing the value of social attention and the momentum of behavior. Number 2 asked what was a high P request sequence, and describe one for a student who argues with the teacher when asked to begin their workbook assignment. So a high P request sequence is when you have a series of requests, there's a high probability the student will comply, high P. Okay, so that means they're not aversive, they're in the student's repertoire, and you intersperse those with difficult, new, or low tolerance tasks, or low P. Okay, so here's an example. First request, ask the student to pass out the workbooks. Then ask them to write their name on their paper. Then ask them to turn on their calculator. Then ask them to do their problem, and then follow up with clear your calculator. Right? So I've got a series of 5 requests here. 4 are high probability and 1 is low. Number 3 asks to describe Carr and Duran's 2-step process for FCT. So the first would be to conduct an FBA to identify stimuli with known reinforcing properties that maintain that problem behavior. So we need to know the function of the behavior so that then you can use those stimuli as reinforcers to develop an alternative behavior. Okay, so and we'll read more about FBAs and get into FCT a little bit more in a later week. But FCT interventions typically involve several behavior change strategies, so it's not just one thing in isolation to teach a communicative response. So often we use things like response prompting, timeout, maybe physical restraint or response blocking, redirection, and extinction of the problem behavior. So we're really using a DR procedure where we're differentially reinforcing an appropriate behavior and putting an inappropriate behavior on extinction. For example, we may be reinforcing when the student asks for a break vocally and ignoring when they break their pencils or throw their materials on the ground. FCT generally needs to have a dense schedule of reinforcement. So the student needs to have lots of opportunities to communicate and therefore receive reinforcement. Verbal prompts should be reduced so that the student's doing it independently. Generally, there are these behavior reduction procedures and then a schedule thinning. But we don't want to thin the schedule of reinforcement until the alternative communication response is in their repertoire. So if they're still sort of grasping onto how to ask for a break, we don't want to all of a sudden, change things too quickly. So I put a resource. There's a really good video from the Virginia Commonwealth University Autism Center for Excellence on Teaching. The VCU Autism Center for Excellence. And the video is on teaching no. So how do you teach students and what's the importance of teaching no? So that video, I think it's about 8 minutes, is posted on Canvas. And it's giving, it has real examples of people with autism. Okay, and question 4 said Tabitha is a student with significant cognitive disability and has very limited speech. She often grabs food from other plates during lunch. Describe how you could use FCT to solve this problem. So your response should include what is the schedule, what is the problem behavior, what is the alternative behavior, how are you going to reinforce that alternative behavior, and then perhaps how are you going to address it in other settings or thin the schedule of reinforcement. Okay, well that wraps it up for our chapter. So now we're going to talk about the personal behavior change project. So step 3 being due really this evening. It says 6:24, but it really means 6:25. So you should have 5 points of baseline data and graph them. So insert your graph below. And then you need to describe your baseline, okay? So is it stable, ascending, or variable? What do the level and trend tell you? And then talk about any patterns you might notice. When I get this, I will give you some feedback on it as you start to think about what your intervention is going to be. Okay, and looking forward, you have step 3 and step 4 of your behavior project coming up, and major topics are due. As a reminder, you turn those into the major topics 1 or 2 assignment links, which are in the major topics module. Okay, if you have any questions, please let me know.